My husband emptied our joint accounts and signed our cottage over to his nephew the week before he asked me for a divorce. I was 73. "You'll be lucky to keep your winter coat," he told me, and he smiled when he said it. 6 weeks later, a constable knocked on my door at 11:30 at night, hat in his hands, and told me my husband had gone off the road on the 401 and wasn't coming home. "Good evening, my friends. It's Donna again, and I'm so glad you've come to sit with me a while. Do me a kindness and tap the like button. Stay with my story until the very end and leave a note telling me which town you're listening from tonight. I love knowing how far my words travel across this big country of ours. People used to ask me how Walter and I lasted 48 years. I'd say it was patience and a good furnace, and they'd laugh, and I'd let them. The truth is plainer than that. I love the man. I love the way he warmed the car for 10 full minutes on a January morning before he'd let me step into it. I love that he called our old Tabby the premier, because she sat at the head of the table like she'd been elected to it. I loved our place out past Bracebridge, the little house in town and the cottage on the lake that his grandfather built with his own 2 hands. I thought we had made something that would hold. I truly did. My name is Eleanor Marsh. I was born in Sudbury, raised on porridge and stubbornness, and I came south to teach grade 4 in Barrie, which is where I met Walter at a church social in the autumn of 1973. We married the next spring. We raised 3 children in a brick house on a maple-lined street, and every Thanksgiving that house smelled of sage and roasting bird and the cinnamon my mother taught me to put in the squash. Our son Theo went west to Calgary for the oil work and married a lovely girl named Ryson. Our daughters, Bridget and Carol, settled close, one in Aurelia, one just up the highway in Gravenhurst. 7 grandchildren between the 3 of them. That was my whole world, and I'd have told you it was carved in granite. The first crack came on an ordinary Wednesday in late October, the kind of day when the maples up here have just turned and the lake throws the color back at you like a second sky. I'd gone to the pharmacy in town to collect Walter's heart pills and my own, and the girl behind the counter, sweet thing, mentioned that Walter had phoned ahead to switch the billing over to a new address. Not our address. A box number in Huntsville. I'd never seen in my life. I told myself it was nothing. Walter was getting forgetful. He was 75. Men muddle these things. But then he started taking his phone out to the woodshed to talk. Walter, who for 40 years couldn't program the VCR and was proud of it, suddenly guarding a little screen like it held the secrets of the nation. He'd drive into town on a Saturday saying he needed lumber and come back 2 hours later with empty hands and no explanation. One evening, I caught a scent off his collar when I hung his coat, something sweet and chemical, a perfume no woman my age would ever wear. I didn't say a word. I'm not a shouter by nature. I watched. I listened. I told myself there'd be a sensible reason, the way there'd always been a sensible reason before. The winter Theo's marriage nearly came apart. The spring, they thought they found something on my mammogram, and it turned out to be a shadow, and nothing more. We'd always come out the other side. Then, just before Christmas, I found the card. I was emptying his good wool coat for the cleaners, and there it was tucked in the breast pocket, a Christmas card, no signature. Only a single letter at the bottom in a careful, looping hand that was nothing like mine. "You make me feel young again. Ass." I stood in our front hall, the hall of the house we'd bought in 1979, where I'd hung 3 children's school photos in a crooked little ladder up the staircase, and I felt the cold come into me from somewhere deep. Just a letter. S. But a letter can be the end of a world, and I knew it the moment I saw it. I said nothing that night nor the next. I made his shepherd's pie. I sat beside him for the hockey game and passed him the bowl of chips when he reached. I laughed at his jokes about the referees. And the whole time I was committing him to memory, the way you'd memorize the route home before a storm takes the road signs down. By the middle of February, I knew her name. Charlene Doucette, 51 years old, a real estate agent out of Huntsville, 24 years younger than my husband. I found her out through a receipt at the bottom of the recycling bin, a dinner for 2 at a place in Port Carling that Walter and I had never once set foot in together. When I finally spoke to him about it, gently, over coffee on a gray Sunday morning, he didn't deny a thing. He set down his mug on the table where we'd taken close to 20,000 breakfasts, and he looked at me with a flatness I'd never seen on his face in nearly half a century, and he said, "Eleanor, I want out. My lawyer will be in touch." That was it. No sorry. No explanation. 48 years. And he ended it the way you'd cancel the newspaper. What came after was a winter and spring of legal misery I had no preparation for. Walter had 3 lawyers. 3. I learned far too late that he'd been quietly rearranging our money for the better part of 2 years before he ever said the word divorce. The cottage on the lake, the one his grandfather built, the one I'd hoped to leave to my grandchildren, had been signed over to his nephew Garrett for $1. The joint accounts had been moved into something his lawyers called a family trust in his name, and what was left for me to look at on paper wouldn't have kept a sensible woman in groceries and property tax for more than a few short years. I hired a fellow in town, a kind man named Donald Pruitt, who'd done our wills and helped us when we bought the second car. He meant well. He was simply out of his depths, and I could see it in how he kept clearing his throat and shuffling his pages. The morning of the final hearing, Walter sat across the courtroom in Bracebridge looking pink-cheeked and rested, and Charlene waited out in the corridor in a camel coat that cost more than my first car. When the judge approved the settlement, handing Walter the trust in the cottage and leaving me with a sliver of a long life's work, my husband leaned toward me as we stood, and he said, low, so only I could hear it, "You'll be lucky to keep your winter coat." And he smiled. I didn't weep. I sat very still with my hands folded in my lap. My mother's ring turned to the inside of my palm the way she used to wear it. And I looked at this man I had loved since I was a young teacher with chalk on her sleeves, and I memorized his face the way I'd memorized everything else that winter. Then I drove north to my sister's place outside North Bay. Margaret, my sister, not to be confused with anything else in this story, was 70, a widow, and she lived in a drafty old house that smelled of wood smoke, and the bread she still baked twice a week out of pure habit. She had the kettle on before I'd even shut the car door. I stayed 3 weeks in her spare room under a quilt our grandmother had stitched. I slept badly. I ate her bread and her bean soup and let her ancient dog lie across my feet, which helped more than I can tell you. I made lists. That's always been my way of thinking a thing through, ever since I kept the register for 31 years of grade 4s. On a yellow pad I found in Margaret's junk drawer, I wrote down everything I'd lost. The cottage first, and the dock, and the loon that came back to that bay every May without fail. Then the money, what the settlement left me, after the lawyer was paid, came to a little under $60,000, and a small share of Walter's teacher's pension that he couldn't fully wall off, thank goodness. That sounds like something until you're 73 with no income, and the kind of bills a body collects as it ages. Then I wrote down my children. Theo had called me exactly once after the hearing. "Mom, Dad told me his side. I think you need to give him some room right now." And he was gone before I could draw breath to answer. Bridget hadn't called at all. Carol sent a text, just a text, saying she was staying out of it, that she loved us both and wouldn't take sides. These were my children. I had walked the floors with every one of their fevers. I'd driven them to hockey practice at 5 in the morning in weather that would frighten a moose, sat in emergency rooms, sewn their Halloween costumes by hand. I'd loved them without a single condition for decades, and they were staying out of it. I wrote their names on that yellow pad too. Not out of spite, just to set down what was true. For the first while, I told myself the job was only to survive. Find a place to live. Sort the money. Keep breathing. Margaret said I could stay forever, and she meant it, but her house was her life, and I have never been a woman who could live indefinitely in the warm shade of somebody else's roof. But somewhere in that 3rd week, sitting at her kitchen table with my cold tea and my yellow pad, something turned over in me. I'd been so fixed on what had been done to me that I'd never stopped to ask the better question. What exactly had Walter done, and was every bit of it legal? I'm no lawyer. I never finished anything past my teaching certificate, but I am not a foolish woman. I balanced our household books for half a century. I ran the bingo accounts and the school fundraising drive, and the year Walter had his gallbladder out, I kept the books for his little surveying business for 6 weeks without dropping a single decimal. I understand paper, I understand numbers, and the more I sat with that timeline, the trust, the dollar deed to the nephew, the 2 years of quiet shuffling before he ever filed, the more one thought kept rising. Donald Pruitt never looked closely enough. I phoned Donald from Margaret's kitchen. He was gentle and sorry and told me he'd reviewed Walter's financial disclosures just as they'd been filed. I asked him one question. Had he checked, independently, whether the transfer of the cottage and the move into the trust happened before Walter formed the intention to leave, or after? Because if Walter shifted family property after he'd already decided to divorce me, but before he filed the papers, that might be what the law calls a fraudulent conveyance, moving assets to cheat a spouse out of her fair share. There was a long silence on the line. Mrs. Boozer. Marsh, Donald said slowly. That's a very particular question. I know it is, I said. Can you answer it? He couldn't. He'd never thought to look. That was the moment the whole thing was born in me. Not out of rage, though the rage was there, steady and low, like the pilot light on Margaret's old stove. It came out of something cooler and far more useful, the plain recognition that the game had been played crooked, and a crooked game can sometimes be made to start over. I needed a different lawyer, somebody who understood hidden assets and family trusts and what happens when a spouse tries to disappear marital property. I needed records I didn't have, and most of all, I needed to understand what Walter had actually done, not what he'd sworn to on a form. I opened the little laptop I'd bought myself to video call the grandchildren, and I went to work. I learned that in Ontario, the law sees marriage as an equal economic partnership, and the matrimonial home in particular gets special protection. You can't simply gift away the family cottage on the sly. I learned that a court can set aside transfers made to defeat a spouse's property claim, and that a $1 deed to a relative is exactly the sort of thing a judge looks at sideways. I wrote it all down in my careful school teacher's hand. Then I found the name of a firm in Toronto that did high net worth family law with a focus on financial misconduct, and I phoned and made an appointment for the following Tuesday. I told Margaret that night over her bean soup. She set down her spoon and gave me a look I knew from childhood, the one that meant she'd decided to be on my side before she'd even heard the whole of it. "You're going after him," she said. It wasn't a question. "I'm going after what's mine," I said. "There's a difference." She reached across and squeezed my hand, and her eyes were wet, and she said, "It's about time, Ellie." The lawyer's name was Priscilla Okafor. She was perhaps 50, with reading glasses pushed up into her hair and an office that looked out over the lake of buildings they call downtown now. She listened to the whole of it without once interrupting, taking notes in a quick, neat shorthand, and when I finished, she took the glasses off her head and folded them and set them on the desk and said, "Mrs. Marsh, I'm going to be direct with you. If the timeline is what you believe it is, your first lawyer left a great deal of money on the table. The question is whether we can prove the intent. And I think we can try." She told me what it would take. A forensic accountant to trace the money. Subpoenas for the bank records Walter had never fully produced. The corporate filings for the trust, and the land registry records showing exactly when the cottage changed hands. It would cost money I barely had. She offered to take a portion of her fee as a contingency against what we recovered because, she said, "I don't like men who think a long marriage entitles them to rob a woman blind on the way out the door." I could have kissed her. So we began. It is a strange thing, at 73, to become a detective in your own life. The forensic accountant, a soft-spoken young man named Wesley with a baby at home, found it in under a month. The cottage had been deeded to the nephew on the 14th of March. The trust had been funded on the 2nd of April, and Walter's first email to his divorce lawyer, which we pried loose through the disclosure Priscilla forced, was dated the 9th of January. He had decided to leave me in the dead of winter and spent the next 3 months quietly carrying our life out the back door before he ever told me to my face. The dates were the whole case. The dates were a confession written in a calendar. We filed to set the divorce settlement aside on the grounds of fraudulent conveyance and incomplete financial disclosure. Walter's 3 lawyers came out swinging. They called it the bitter fantasy of a scorned wife. They said the cottage was a gift to family, and the trust was sound estate planning, and I was simply unwilling to accept the end of my marriage. Priscilla never raised her voice. She laid the calendar in front of the judge, the January email, the March deed, the April trust, and she said quietly that you do not give away your grandfather's cottage to your nephew for $1 3 months after you've privately resolved to divorce your wife, unless you are trying to make sure she never sees a nickel of it. And here is the part I still turn over on my porch some evenings. The week before our hearing on the motion was set to begin, on a black stretch of the 401 west of Toronto, in freezing rain, Walter's car left the road and struck the concrete of an overpass. He died at the scene. 76 years old. The constable who came to my door that night didn't know yet that we were divorced. He had the old emergency contact on file, the one from a decade of marriage. And so the news came to me first, before it reached Charlene, before it reached the children, in the cold of my own front hall at 11:30 at night. I want to tell you the truth about what I felt because I promised you the truth at the start. I did not feel triumphant. I felt the floor go soft under me. The man I'd loved for 48 years and the man who'd tried to leave me with my winter coat were somehow the same man, and they both died on that highway. And I grieved the first one even as I could not forgive the second. I sat down on the bottom stair under the crooked ladder of my children's school photos, and I cried. Not the tears he'd wanted from me in that courtroom, but real ones, old ones, for the boy who'd warmed the car on January mornings a lifetime ago. The children came home for the funeral, all 3, and for one strange gray afternoon we were a family again in a church basement over weak coffee and day squares. Theo couldn't meet my eyes. Bridget held my arm too tightly. Carol cried and said she was sorry, and I knew she didn't fully understand yet what she was sorry for. But I took it anyway because I am not a woman who refuses an open hand. Now, you might think that with Walter gone, the lawsuit was finished. It wasn't. Death doesn't erase a fraud, it only changes who you're arguing with. The cottage was still sitting in the nephew's name, and the trust was now part of an estate, and the estate, it turned out, had named Charlene to receive a tidy sum. So Priscilla simply turned the case toward the estate and the nephew. And the same calendar that had been a confession against Walter was now a confession against everyone who'd helped him hide the money. Garrett, the nephew, folded almost at once. He was a decent enough young man who'd been talked into signing a deed he never properly understood. And when Priscilla's letter landed on his kitchen table, he called and said he wanted no part of it and would give the cottage back. The trust was harder, but the dates don't lie, and after a mediation that ran 2 long days in a downtown boardroom, the estate agreed to set the trust transfers aside and divide the marital property the way the law in this province says it ought to have been divided from the start. Equally, the cottage came back into the estate and was split, and because I could not bear to sell the place his grandfather built with his hands, I bought out the children's small shares with my own portion, and it became mine, fully and finally, in the autumn of my 74th year. As for Charlene Doucette, the sum the estate had meant for her was a claim that stood behind mine in line, because a court judgment for property equalization comes ahead of a gift in a will. By the time the lawyers and the accountant and the equalization were settled, the residue she'd been counting on had all but vanished. She contested it, of course. She hired her own lawyer and argued she'd been promised. She lost. I heard later, through the long grapevine of small towns, that the brokerage she worked for had quietly let her go once the story made its rounds, and that the camel coat had been seen at the consignment shop in Huntsville. I felt no joy at that. What I felt was something quieter and steadier, the recognition that a life does, more often than people my age are willing to say, bend itself eventually back toward what's fair. Not always. Not on any schedule you'd choose. But sometimes. And this was one of those times. I didn't stay up north in the end. The lake holds its memories close, and I needed a stretch of water that hadn't watched my whole marriage. I rented a little apartment in Niagara-on-the-Lake for a season, near the river, where the light comes off the water in the evening softer than it ever did up on the Shield. I walked the parkway every morning past the old vineyards. I found a library and made myself a regular nuisance there. There was a small choir at the church that wanted an alto, and though I hadn't sung properly since my 40s, I joined, and the first night I stood up among those voices, I felt something in my chest unlock that I thought was rusted shut for good. I found a women's group through Priscilla. Of all people, she put me in touch with a circle of women who'd been through their own versions of my winter, and in time I stopped being the one who needed the chair by the door and became the one who poured the tea and listened while a newly shattered woman told her story with shaking hands. I meet a friend named Geraldine, 75, a retired veterinarian from Thunder Bay with a laugh that arrived like a sudden squall off the lake. And we walked 3 mornings a week and fought cheerfully about novels at the farmer's market on Saturdays the way only people who take books seriously can fight. My children and I found our way to something, not the closeness I dreamed of, not the cold silence I'd feared, but a careful, honest middle ground. Theo phones the first Sunday of every month, and we talk about Rosen and the weather in Calgary, and never ever about that winter. Bridget and I email. Carol drove down last spring with the 2 littlest grandchildren, and we made shortbread together in my small kitchen, flour on every surface, and she stopped at one point with her hands in the dough and said, "I should have called you Mom." And I said, "Yes, you should have." And then I hugged her, because both things were true and a person can hold both. I bought a small house this past spring on a quiet street a few blocks back from the river, with a garden grown wild from neglect and a covered porch where the evenings stretched long and gold. And I did one thing more. The cottage up north is mine now, and I go up in the summers. And last May I planted a young tree at the corner of the dock, not a maple. Those take longer than I have, but a serviceberry, which the old folks in Sudbury called a Saskatoon. The first thing to bloom white along the rivers up north when the ice finally gives. It will feed the birds, and it will outlive me, and that suits me fine. I sat on that dock one evening in June with a cup of tea going cold in my hands, and the loon calling out on the dark water the way it has every summer of my life, and I thought, this is mine. The hard winter that made it, and the long peace that came after, all of it, mine. Here is what I know now that I didn't know at 73. Old age is not the same thing as weakness. Grief does not put an end to clear thinking, and the people who are counting on your silence, a husband, a lawyer, a whole room full of men in good suits, are very often the ones most surprised in the end by the sound of your voice. I'm not a remarkable woman. I'm only a woman who decided when it mattered most to pay attention. What would you have done in my place? Would you have taken the sliver they offered and gone quietly off to live small? I've wondered about it many nights. I don't judge a soul who'd have chosen the quiet road. But it wasn't the road for me. If any part of my story stayed with you tonight, leave me a comment and tell me your town. Give this a like, so it finds another woman who needs to hear it. And thank you, truly, from the bottom of my heart, for listening. The thing I keep coming back to, on the dock these long June evenings, is that nothing that happened to Walter happened by accident. A man who decides in January to carry his wife's life out the back door, who deeds his grandfather's cottage to a nephew for a single dollar, who teaches his own children to call cruelty giving him room. That man is not undone by bad luck on a wet highway. He is undone by the long arithmetic of his own choices, finally coming due. I didn't wish the 401 on him. I grieved the boy who warmed the car on January mornings. But I have stopped pretending that the ending surprised me. You cannot spend 2 years building a house of small betrayals and act shocked when the floor gives way. What saved me was not cleverness, not exactly. It was the decision to keep my hands clean when every part of me wanted to throw something. I never lied. I never forged a date or hid $1 or sank to the level of 3 lawyers in good suits calling me a bitter old woman. I simply told the truth and made the truth do the heavy lifting. When you have nothing left but your good name, you guard it like the last log on the fire, because it turns out a clean conscience is the one thing a courtroom cannot take from you, and the one thing that makes a judge lean forward and listen. But being honest wasn't enough on its own, and I won't pretend it was. I had to think. I had to sit at Margaret's kitchen table with a cold cup of tea and ask the colder question. Not what was done to me, but what was actually done, and whether it was lawful. That single question, the one poor Donald never thought to ask, was worth more than all my weeping. I had balanced household books for 50 years, and I'd forgotten those were a kind of power. They were. Pay attention to the numbers, to the dates, to the small wrong thing on the pharmacy receipt. The careless leave a trail, and the watchful read it. And then there is the plain stubbornness of getting up. There were mornings in North Bay I did not want to. 73 years old, $60,000 to my name, 3 children who'd gone quiet, the easy thing, the road most people would forgive me for taking, was to disappear into something small and let it lie. I didn't, and I'd tell any woman listening tonight not to either. Strength at our age doesn't roar. It just refuses to lie down. It phones the second lawyer. It keeps the appointment on Tuesday. So if my story leaves you with anything, let it be this. Keep your hands honest, keep your mind awake, and when life knocks you flat in the cold, get up one more time than it knocks you down. Walter counted on me being too old, too tired, and too decent to fight. He was right about decent. He was dead wrong about the rest. That serviceberry I planted will bloom white every spring after I'm gone, and I planted it not as revenge but as proof that a woman pushed off her own land can root herself somewhere new and outlast the men who underestimated her.